There is a moment in a man's life when he realizes something quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in silence. He realizes that attention from a younger woman does not always mean he is winning. Sometimes, it only means he is being tested. And most men fail that test without even knowing it. Because the danger is never the age gap. The danger is what the age gap awakens inside the man who is not disciplined. And once that part is awakened, logic starts to disappear. Self-control starts to weaken. And judgment starts to blur. This is where mistakes begin. Not because the man is weak, but because he stops being grounded. And in that moment, everything changes. Many older men think they are in control when a younger woman shows interest. They believe they are leading. They believe they are choosing. They believe they are the ones setting the pace. But Stoic wisdom teaches something very different. Control is not what you think you are doing. Control is what you are still able to maintain inside yourself while emotions are pulling you outward. And most men lose that control quietly. They don't notice it happening. At first, it starts small. A message replied faster than usual. A conversation extended longer than planned. A smile that stays in the mind longer than it should. Then slowly, the mind begins to shift. And once the mind shifts, behavior follows. That is where the real change begins. Not in her actions, but in your reactions. The first thing you must understand is this. Never use a younger woman to feel young again. That is the beginning of self-deception. Because the moment you try to use someone's presence to repair your perception of time, you are no longer present in reality. You are escaping it. And a man who escapes reality always loses clarity. You may start dressing differently. You may start acting differently. You may start trying to match energy that does not belong to your stage of life. Not because it is authentic, but because you are trying to feel something you think you lost. But Stoicism does not support emotional escape. It demands emotional awareness. You are not meant to become younger. You are meant to become more grounded, more controlled, more aware, and more deliberate with every choice you make. There is something most men never admit to themselves. When a younger woman shows interest, it is not only her that they are attracted to. It is the feeling she gives them about themselves. They start feeling seen again. They start feeling relevant again. They start feeling chosen again. And slowly, the identity becomes dependent on that feeling. That is where the danger lies. Because now, it is no longer about connection. It is about validation. And validation is unstable. It changes. It fluctuates. It disappears without warning. And when it disappears, confusion begins. A Stoic man does not depend on external validation to stabilize his identity. He observes it. But he does not build his self-worth on it. If you are an older man in this situation, there is something you must be aware of immediately. Never assume that attention equals alignment. Just because she is interested in you does not mean she understands you. Just because she laughs at your jokes does not mean she shares your values. Just because she enjoys your presence does not mean she is building the same future you are thinking about. This is where many men begin to create illusions. They start projecting future meaning onto present attraction. They start imagining depth where there is only curiosity. They start assuming stability where there is only experience. And slowly, they begin to invest emotionally into something that was never structured to hold that weight. Stoicism warns against this. Do not add meaning where only observation is required. Now listen carefully. One of the biggest mistakes an older man can make is to overperform for a younger woman. Over-talking, over-explaining, over-proving. Trying to appear more interesting than necessary. Trying to stay more relevant than natural. Trying to compete with younger energy instead of leading with grounded presence. But here is the truth. Real masculine stability does not compete. It anchors. It does not chase attention. It maintains direction. And it does not lose itself in pursuit of being chosen. Because a man who is always trying to be chosen has already forgotten that he is supposed to be choosing how he lives. There is also another silent trap. The more attention you get from a younger woman, the more you may begin to relax your standards. Things you would normally not tolerate begin to feel acceptable. Behavior you would normally question begins to feel normal. Inconsistencies you would normally walk away from begin to feel manageable. And without noticing it, your standards begin to shrink. Not because she is forcing you, but because you are adjusting yourself to maintain access. And this is where self-respect begins to erode quietly. Stoic thinking does not allow this kind of internal compromise. A man who abandons his standards for attention is not in control of his life. He is reacting to it. Let this be clear. You are not supposed to lose your identity in connection. You are supposed to remain aware inside it. A younger woman may bring excitement, energy, curiosity, and even admiration. But none of that should cause you to abandon your principles. Because principles are what keep you stable when emotions rise. And without stability, attraction becomes distortion. You stop seeing clearly. You stop thinking clearly. And eventually, you stop acting clearly. Now, before we go deeper, listen to this carefully. If you are finding value in this, subscribe to the channel right now. Not later. Because what we are building here is not entertainment. It is discipline. It is clarity. It is mental control for men who want to stay grounded in a world that pulls them into emotional chaos. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Now back to the truth. Another major mistake older men make is believing they must always guide or control the dynamic. They begin to act like teachers, like advisors, like directors of behavior, trying to shape her decisions, trying to influence her thinking, trying to position themselves as the center of wisdom in her life. But the moment guidance turns into control, resistance is created, and resistance destroys connection. A younger woman does not need to be controlled. She needs to be understood. And understanding does not require domination. It requires awareness. Stoicism teaches something very important here. You are only responsible for your own behavior. Not the outcome of someone else's decisions. Not the direction of someone else's life. Not the emotional reactions of someone else's mind. Your responsibility ends where another person's autonomy begins. The moment you forget this, you begin to overreach. And overreach always leads to imbalance. There is also something deeper happening that most men do not notice. The emotional shift does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually. You begin to think about her more than necessary. You begin to check your phone more often than usual. You begin to interpret small signals as meaningful signs. And slowly, your emotional center begins to move outward. No longer inside you, but around her presence. And when your emotional center is no longer inside you, you are no longer fully grounded. You are reacting instead of observing. And that is where mistakes multiply. A stoic man does not allow his emotions to be governed by external presence. He experiences them. but he does not surrender control of them. He does not deny attraction, but he does not become controlled by it. He does not reject connection, but he does not depend on it. There is a balance, and that balance is discipline. Now listen closely. Everything you have heard so far is only the beginning. Because the real danger is not what happens when things are going well. The real danger is what happens when uncertainty enters the dynamic. When communication becomes inconsistent. When attention becomes unpredictable. When emotional clarity begins to fade. That is when most men lose themselves completely. And that is exactly where we are going next. When consistency disappears, something very important is revealed about a man. Not about the woman. About the man. Because inconsistency does not create emotional instability. It exposes emotional instability that was already there but hidden. This is where most older men begin to lose control without realizing it. At first, they try to interpret it logically. Maybe she is busy. Maybe she is distracted. Maybe she is just naturally inconsistent. And sometimes, those assumptions feel comforting. But underneath that comfort, something deeper is happening. The mind is trying to protect emotional attachment, not seek truth. And Stoicism teaches that truth must always come before comfort. When a younger woman becomes inconsistent in attention, response, or emotional availability, many older men begin to enter a cycle. A cycle of observation, interpretation, and emotional adjustment. They start reading meaning into silence. They start analyzing tone in messages. They start rethinking conversations that were already completed. And slowly, their internal peace begins to depend on external signals. This is where discipline breaks down. Not in action, but in thought. Because the moment your mind starts negotiating with uncertainty, you are no longer in control of it. A Stoic man understands something very simple. You do not build emotional stability on unpredictable behavior. If something is inconsistent, you do not try to stabilize it with more attention. You stabilize yourself by stepping back into awareness. But most men do the opposite. They try to fix uncertainty by increasing investment. More messages. More attention. More effort. More emotional availability. Thinking that consistency can be earned through intensity. But human behavior does not work like that. An attraction does not stabilize under pressure. It either exists naturally or it does not exist in the form you are imagining. This is where another dangerous pattern begins. Overthinking disguised as interest. A man starts believing he is simply trying to understand her. But what he is really doing is trying to regain emotional control through mental effort. He replays conversations. He studies patterns. He tries to predict behavior. Not because he is curious, but because he is uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. So the mind creates activity to escape discomfort. But Stoicism does not reward mental chaos. It rewards clarity. And clarity comes from detachment, not obsession. Now listen carefully. One of the most dangerous traps for an older man in this dynamic is emotional dependency disguised as maturity. It does not look like desperation. It looks like patience. It looks like understanding. It looks like being calm and composed. But inside, there is expectation. There is waiting. There is silent emotional investment tied to outcomes that are not guaranteed. And that is not Stoic strength. That is controlled attachment. A Stoic man does not wait emotionally for anyone. He engages fully in the present moment. But he does not attach his emotional stability to future responses. He does not build internal peace on delayed validation. He does not create emotional dependency through imagination. Because imagination is where most suffering begins, not reality. There is another mistake that becomes very obvious in this stage. Older men begin to over-explain themselves. They start justifying their time, their intentions, their actions, trying to ensure they are not misunderstood, trying to maintain clarity in a situation that is already unclear. But the truth is simple. A man who is secure does not need to constantly explain his presence. His presence explains itself. Excess explanation is not communication. It is emotional reassurance seeking disguised as clarity. And it weakens presence instead of strengthening it. Now we must talk about power. Not control over someone else, but control over yourself in the presence of uncertainty. Because when inconsistency appears, emotional power shifts quietly. Not because she takes it, but because you give it away through reaction. Every time you overthink, you lose a piece of internal stability. Every time you overtext to fix silence, you weaken your grounding. Every time you interpret uncertainty emotionally instead of observing it calmly, you lose clarity. And clarity is the real power. A younger woman may not even be aware of the emotional impact she has on the older man. She may simply be living her life, exploring, responding when she feels like it, with no intention of creating emotional disturbance. But impact does not require intention, and that is where responsibility returns to the man. Because Stoicism does not focus on controlling others. It focuses on controlling response. If you cannot remain stable in inconsistency, you are not stable. You are dependent. And dependency always creates suffering. Not immediately, but eventually. Because what you depend on will never remain predictable. Now let's go deeper into something most men never admit. When attention is inconsistent, the emotional highs become stronger. A message after silence feels more intense. A smile after distance feels more meaningful. A response after waiting feels more valuable. And slowly, the emotional system begins to adapt to instability. This is very dangerous, because the brain starts associating unpredictability with excitement. And excitement becomes mistaken for connection. But they are not the same thing. One is emotional stimulation. The other is emotional alignment. And confusion between the two destroys judgment. A Stoic man does not allow emotional spikes to define value. He observes patterns without attaching meaning to emotional highs or lows. Because stability is not found in intensity. It is found in consistency. And consistency is what reveals truth over time, not momentary emotion. Now listen carefully. This is where many older men lose self-respect without realizing it. They start adjusting their behavior to match emotional fluctuations. When she is warm, they become more available. When she is distant, they become more careful. When she is responsive, they become more expressive. When she withdraws, they become more anxious. And slowly, their entire emotional state becomes reactive. No longer self-led, but externally controlled. A man in this state may still appear composed on the outside, but internally, he is no longer leading himself. He is responding. And response without control is instability. Stoic discipline is not about suppressing emotion. It is about maintaining internal direction regardless of external change. Now I need you to understand something very clearly. If a connection makes you lose clarity, it is not a connection problem. It is a self-control problem. Because anything that destabilizes your mind is revealing where discipline is missing. Not where love is missing. Not where attention is missing. But where internal grounding is missing. This is why Stoicism always brings the focus back to self. Not the other person. Not the outcome. Not the behavior of others. But your internal state. Because that is the only thing you can actually govern. Everything else is variable. Now, before we continue deeper, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Because what we are building here is not casual motivation. It is mental structure. It is emotional discipline. It is the kind of clarity most men only develop after losing control too many times. Subscribe now so you stay aligned with this level of thinking. Now let's continue. The final layer of this stage is acceptance. Not emotional surrender, but intellectual acceptance of reality as it is, not as you want it to be. If communication is inconsistent, accept it. If attention fluctuates, observe it. If clarity is missing, acknowledge it. Because denial is what creates emotional distortion. And distortion leads to wrong decisions. A Stoic man does not force meaning. He waits for patterns to reveal themselves. He does not rush interpretation. He allows time to expose truth. Because time always reveals what emotion tries to hide. And this is where real strength begins. Not in pursuit. Not in control. But in restraint. The ability to remain stable when nothing is guaranteed. The ability to observe without reacting. The ability to feel without dependency. That is where masculinity becomes grounded. Not in age. Not in experience. But in discipline. At a certain point, every man must face a quiet truth. Not about women. Not about relationships. But about himself. Because the real battle is never external. It is internal. And most men only realize this after they have already lost control of their emotions too many times. There is a stage in this dynamic where attachment stops feeling obvious. It becomes subtle. Almost invisible. A man no longer feels like he is chasing. He no longer feels like he is desperate. He no longer feels like he is emotionally dependent. But his actions still reveal something different. He is still waiting. Still checking. Still interpreting. Still emotionally reacting in silence. And this is the most dangerous stage. Because now the loss of control no longer feels like loss of control. It feels like normal behavior. A Stoic man recognizes this immediately. Because he understands that discipline is not tested when emotions are intense. It is tested when emotions are quiet but persistent. When nothing dramatic is happening. But the mind is still engaged. Still attached. Still observing for meaning where none has been confirmed. That is where most men fail without realizing it. One of the deepest traps in this situation is ego attachment disguised as connection. At first, it feels like interest. Then it becomes curiosity. Then it becomes expectation. And finally, it becomes identity. A man starts to feel important because of how she responds. He starts to feel valuable because of her attention. He starts to feel chosen because of her presence. And slowly, his ego begins to tie itself to her behavior. Not because she asked for it, but because he allowed it. This is where Stoicism becomes extremely important. Because Stoicism teaches that your value is not assigned by external attention. Your value is determined by your internal order. If your emotional state rises and falls based on someone else's behavior, then your foundation is not stable. It is borrowed. and anything borrowed can be taken back at any time. Now there is something most men refuse to admit. The emotional bond they think they are building is often not mutual. It is one-sided reinforcement. A cycle of hope and interpretation. A message becomes meaning. A delay becomes analysis. A response becomes emotional reward. And a lack of response becomes emotional tension. This cycle keeps the mind engaged even when reality is not changing. And engagement without clarity leads to illusion. A Stoic man breaks this cycle by stepping outside interpretation. He does not assign emotional weight to every action. He does not create narratives from silence. He does not assume depth from attention. He observes behavior without emotional expansion. Because expansion without truth leads to fantasy. Now listen carefully. One of the biggest ego traps for an older man is believing that experience automatically gives emotional control. It does not. Experience only gives awareness of patterns. Control still requires discipline. And without discipline, experience becomes useless. A man can know everything logically and still lose emotionally. Because knowledge does not override attachment. Only awareness and restraint can. There is also another silent trap. The desire to win the situation. To be chosen. To be preferred. To be validated as the better option. Even when the man pretends he is not competing, the ego quietly enters comparison. Other men become invisible competition in his mind. Her attention becomes something to secure rather than something to observe. And once the mind enters competition, emotional neutrality disappears. A Stoic man does not compete for validation. He does not position his worth against others. He understands that comparison is a distortion of self-perception. Because the moment you start competing for attention, you stop standing in your own identity. You start reacting to external positioning. And that weakens internal authority. Now here is something deeper. Most emotional suffering in this dynamic does not come from what is happening. It comes from what is imagined. Imagined conversations. Imagined futures. Imagined meanings. Imagined intentions. The mind starts filling gaps with stories. And those stories begin to feel real, even when they are not confirmed. This is where emotional attachment grows fastest. Not in reality, but in imagination. A Stoic man trains himself to separate observation from interpretation. He sees what is happening, not what he hopes is happening, not what he fears is happening, but what is actually happening. Because clarity only exists in truth, not projection. Now let's go deeper into self-respect. At a certain point, if a man is not careful, he begins to tolerate emotional inconsistency in silence. He convinces himself that patience is maturity, that waiting is understanding, that accepting uncertainty is wisdom. But there is a difference between patience and self-abandonment. Patience is grounded. Self-abandonment is emotional dependency in disguise. A Stoic man does not abandon himself to maintain access. He does not shrink his standards to preserve connection. He does not silence his awareness to avoid discomfort. Because discomfort is not the enemy. Loss of self is. Now listen carefully. If a situation repeatedly creates confusion, it is not a situation to decode endlessly. It is a situation to observe and step back from emotionally. Because clarity is not created through effort. It is revealed through distance and time. This is where real emotional power begins. Not in trying harder. Not in thinking more. Not in analyzing deeper. but in stepping back enough to remain centered. Because a centered man is not pulled into emotional turbulence. He observes it from stability. Now I need you to understand this final layer. A man who is emotionally reactive in silence is still reactive. Even if no one sees it. Even if no action is taken. Even if everything looks calm externally. Internal reaction is still instability. And Stoicism is about internal governance, not external appearance. So what does a Stoic man actually do here? He engages without attachment. He observes without assumption. He communicates without dependency. And he remains anchored in his own life regardless of external attention. Because his identity is not being built in someone else's response. It is already established within him. Now before we continue further, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Because what you are learning here is not surface advice. It is mental restructuring. It is emotional discipline. It is how men stop losing themselves in situations that feel powerful but are actually unstable. Subscribe now so you do not miss the final part. Now we move into the final layer. The part where everything becomes clear. Where illusion ends. And Stoic clarity fully takes over. At the end of all emotional confusion, all interpretation, all silence, all attention, and all inconsistency, one truth remains unchanged. A man either has control over himself, or he does not. Everything else is secondary. Because situations will always change. People will always change. Attention will always fluctuate. Interest will rise and fall. But internal discipline either exists, or it does not. And that is where everything finally becomes clear. There is a final stage most men reach in this dynamic. A quiet realization that what they were trying to stabilize externally was never stable to begin with. Not because the other person was wrong. Not because the situation was bad. But because they were trying to build emotional certainty on something naturally uncertain. And that is impossible. A Stoic man understands something simple but powerful. You cannot control how someone behaves. You can only control how you respond to what they show you consistently over time. Not moments. Not highlights. Not emotional spikes. But patterns. Because patterns reveal reality. Everything else is noise. Now listen carefully. One of the biggest turning points for an older man is when he stops trying to interpret every action and starts observing the overall structure of the situation. Not analyzing messages. Not decoding tone. Not searching for hidden meaning. But stepping back and asking one question. Is this making me more stable or less stable? If the answer is less stable, no explanation is needed. Clarity is already present. Because emotional confusion is not a puzzle to solve. It is a signal. A signal that your internal balance is being disrupted. And Stoicism teaches that anything which repeatedly disrupts your peace is not meant to be emotionally central in your life. It may exist. It may be enjoyed. But it must not control your internal state. Now let's go deeper into something most men avoid. Letting go is not about losing someone. It is about reclaiming yourself. Because many men think detachment is about distance. But true detachment is about internal independence. It is the ability to remain the same person emotionally whether someone is present or absent. That is real strength. Not emotional fluctuation. A younger woman may bring excitement into an older man's life. That is not the issue. The issue begins when excitement replaces stability. When excitement becomes the center of emotional experience. When presence becomes dependency. when attention becomes identity, and when silence becomes emotional disturbance. That is when the man is no longer in control. A Stoic man does not reject emotion. He understands it. He experiences it fully. But he does not allow it to lead him away from his principles. Because principles are what keep a man stable when emotions are unstable. And without principles, emotions become decision makers. And emotions are terrible decision makers. Now here is the final misunderstanding that must be corrected. Many men think strength is shown by holding on, by proving loyalty, by waiting longer, by trying harder, by being more understanding. But in reality, uncontrolled holding on is not strength. It is attachment. And attachment without clarity leads to self-loss. Real strength is knowing when your internal peace is being compromised and choosing to protect it. Not out of anger, not out of ego, but out of discipline. Because a man who cannot protect his peace cannot protect his life direction. Now listen closely. A Stoic man does not stay in situations that constantly require him to question his value. He does not remain where he must overthink to feel secure. He does not stay where he must interpret silence to find meaning. Because anything that requires constant emotional decoding is not stable enough to build peace on. Instead, he returns to structure, his goals, his purpose, his discipline, his identity outside of emotional distraction. Because that is what keeps him grounded. Not external validation, not attention, not temporary connection, but internal direction. And here is the final truth most men eventually realize. Peace is not found in controlling external behavior. Peace is found in no longer being controlled internally by external behavior. That is the shift. That is the awakening. That is the Stoic position. So what should an older man actually do in this situation? He should remain aware without attachment. He should observe without assumption. He should engage without dependency. And he should never abandon his standards for temporary attention. Because standards are not about controlling others. They are about protecting yourself. Now before we end this completely, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Because this is not casual content. This is disciplined training for the mind. For emotional control. For clarity. For men who are done losing themselves in situations that feel powerful but quietly destroy inner stability. Subscribe now so you stay aligned with this level of thinking. Now the final truth. The goal was never to avoid younger women. The goal was never to fear connection. The goal was never to reject attraction. The goal was always the same. Self-mastery. Because a man who masters himself does not lose himself in any situation. He remains centered. He remains aware. He remains disciplined. And he remains in control of his life direction no matter who enters it. And that is the real Stoic wisdom. Not control over others. Control over self. Not emotional reaction. But emotional discipline. Not dependence. But inner stability. Now listen carefully one last time. Most men think the lesson is about women. But the real lesson was never about that. It was about what gets exposed inside a man when discipline is missing. Because age does not automatically create control. Experience does not automatically create wisdom. And attention does not automatically create meaning. Only self-mastery does. There is a reason Stoic men are hard to manipulate. It is not because they do not feel. It is because they do not lose themselves in what they feel. They observe emotion without becoming it. They experience attraction without surrendering judgment. They engage life without letting life control them. That is the difference. If you remember nothing else from this entire message, remember this. Anything that pulls you away from your center repeatedly is not strength entering your life. It is distraction testing your discipline. And your response to that distraction determines who you are becoming. Not your intentions. Not your words. Your response. A younger woman, an older woman, attention, silence, distance, closeness, inconsistency, attraction. All of these are just external conditions. But your internal state is your responsibility. And Stoicism always brings you back to that truth. Not control outward. Control inward. Because a man who is emotionally grounded does not need to prove anything. He does not need to chase validation. He does not need to over-explain his value. He does not need to compete for attention. He simply lives in alignment with his principles. And anything that fits into that life stays. Anything that disrupts it naturally loses importance. Not through anger, but through clarity. And this is where most men finally evolve. When they stop reacting. When they stop over-investing emotionally in uncertainty. When they stop trying to decode what should simply be observed. And when they finally understand that peace is not something you find in someone else. It is something you protect inside yourself. Now, if you made it this far, it means you are not watching this for entertainment. You are watching for awareness, for control, for discipline. So let me say this clearly. Subscribe to the channel right now. Because what you are learning here is not surface motivation. It is mental structure. It is emotional intelligence. It is the foundation of becoming a man who does not lose himself in anything.